Okay, so last time we looked at how the Fatima apparitions, particularly the prophecy of an era of peace during our time, is affecting the world today in relation to terrorism. Because obviously, if there is to be an era of peace, then there has to be an end to bloody confrontations, wars, and violence of that nature. So we talked about how this is really a major crime of the last century and this century, continuation of the crimes of the 20th century into the 21st century. So now, if we start from the premise that Israel planned an attack on New York City for 2001, planned in advance, probably 20 years in advance, let's say, as an estimate, around 1980 or so. And that continued on while the government of Israel was acting as though they had normal, friendly relationships with the United States. It was all a big lie, obviously. So what does this portend in terms of consequences that have to be brought about or endured for the future? I mean, there's two alternatives. America can either go along with this charade and continue to be abused by Israeli Jews and their Jewish agents in the United States, whether they're Israeli citizens or not, whether they're employees of the Israeli government or not. Or the other alternatives, we as Americans can stand up and say, no, we don't go along with this anymore. We're a Christian nation, and we will oppose any efforts by Jews to subvert our government or our society, our morals, and our economic prosperity or government, anything like that, which has been put into jeopardy since the creation of the State of Israel. So we have to reflect and say, was it a good idea to form an alliance with Israel in order to secure some kind of a stability in the Middle East? Well, we see that it's always been the case that the Jewish people, by this I don't mean every single Jew, I mean the leaders of the group that formed the Jewish nation after Christ was crucified and the destruction of the Jewish temple, those Jews in exile that were leading the group of people who were the ethnic Jews, and basically they rejected Christ. Well, their descendants or their followers in today's world are the ones that still oppose Christ and his church, because Christ did found a church, appointing St. Peter as the head of the church. So this has continued down into history today. Now, we can't blame the Jewish people because no one has control over the circumstances of their own birth. So if there were some Jews at that time who did reject Christ and other people followed them, it must have been at least 20 generations since that time. And the people who are Jews today simply were taught this from the time when they first began to become aware of the world. So we have to look at it in that perspective. Now the church is taking this approach now of dialogue with the Jews, because the church recognizes that the Jews themselves who are alive today did not cause the death of Christ. They just simply inherited from their parents what was taught to them. So our nation, as do all the nations of the world, have the right to defend themselves. Now, if the Jews in Israel want to attack our nation again, we have to make sure that we are defending ourselves, that there is going to be an appropriate response to that, so that we will protect what we have in this country, our values as a Christian nation. Now, what we're seeing here is that the Fatima prophecies do indicate to us as Christians that we are living in this era of peace. So we know that peace cannot coexist with a state of continual unrest in the world. There has to be reconciliation there, okay? And if Israel is refusing to budge on this point because they have rejected Christ, that they're continuing to try and create this imaginary utopian world, and that they pick leaders, like for instance, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was a known terrorist, brought up as a terrorist, and has a completely psychopathological worldview, which he believes it's okay to kill innocent people to achieve a goal that he or his fanatic supporters may have. If that's the case, then we have to, as a Christian nation, say, no, we are not going to go along with that. And the Jews that are trying to subvert our nation, there are plenty of them in our government, in Congress particularly, and there are plenty of them in the executive branch, and there are sympathizers in the judicial branch. I'm thinking now of Justice Kennedy. He's a Jewish sympathizer who voted in favor of same-sex marriage, which is simply another Jewish attempt. They've had many failed attempts. The Zionists have many failed attempts to undermine our moral standards in this country. But Kennedy has gone along with that, and he was the deciding vote, which destroyed marriage as an institution, and put up this fake legal structure, which doesn't really have any basis in reality. So we have to change all that. Now, the Trump administration is in the process of doing that. It's changing the rules for Health and Human Services Department to recognize that life does begin at its conception. Okay, that's simply a scientific fact. Our lives begin at the moment of conception. So if someone goes in and aborts a child, a doctor, whoever it is, that's an act of murder, because the child's life begins at conception, regardless of what they call it. So now the other thing is, in Congress, they're now starting to defund Planned Parenthood. The Justice Department will bring charges, criminal charges, against some of the leaders that work for Planned Parenthood. Again, they're working with this Judaizing attempt to reform the American society, which is all based on social engineering. It doesn't have any basis in our traditions as a people of Western culture. And then we see, again, we see that the Trump administration is now taking measures which will resolve some of these problems. And And so it's going to take a long time, but we as a Christian nation, we have this responsibility, especially Catholics. So Catholics who are opposed to the Christian culture are basically taking the role of Judas, who led to, who betrayed Jesus Christ and brought him, and it led to his execution by turning him over to the leaders of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which St. Paul calls, even to this day, it continued on as the synagogue of Satan. In other words, it's not really an authentic continuation of the covenant which God entered into with Abraham, covenant that includes the Jewish people as well as the Gentiles, which will all become, of course, God's people, the new Israel, which is the Roman Catholic Church at this time. Or should I say the Catholic Church, because there are other rites as well that are in union with the Pope that belong within this great structure of the church. So here we are today now, and it's our decision to make. I mean, each person has to make that decision. You have to be on one side or the other. Now, there's a viewpoint that's rather Manichaean. It's unfortunate that this has crept in, but it's basically saying that we don't want to have any discussions with the Jews because they've already sided with being against Christ, and they have to be brought into the church through baptism. We have to only try, that they want to just simply go out and try to preach to the Jews and bring them into the church. However, this has not been effective, so we don't want this Manichaean all or nothing approach. No, we do want to maintain avenues of discussion with Jews, and we do want to engage with Jewish groups where we can reach some kind of a civil understanding, and we do as individuals want to reach out to the Jews and bring them into Christ's fold, which is the church. Now, this is, I can look back in my own life. I was growing up, there were several in my family that we went to a Catholic high school, and one of my brothers was involved in theater production there, several productions, including Fiddler on the Roof. So the instructor of this theater was actually a Jewish woman, and she, because of my brother's participation in these plays, she got to know my mother, who was Catholic. So, and it turned out that this friendship resulted in the conversion of this woman and baptism into becoming a Catholic. So that's how I think it's more effective to achieve this goal of unity, which was we really want unity within the church, and then bringing in others who may not even be Christians to become Christians and become part of this, because this is what God really does want. Now, my own personal descent is European, although I'm an American. My descent goes back to Europe, and on the paternal side, it goes all the way back. My DNA does to an Irish king whose name was Brian. He lived in around the beginning of the year 1000 and up to 1013, and of course he was born in the prior century. But I only discovered that through my DNA, because my last name doesn't necessarily reflect descent from this particular individual. So I was able to actually trace back the descent from my own surname, which at least using probability, or perhaps just simply an educated guess, because there were people in the same area, location, where my paternal DNA does extend back to, which had basically the same last name as mine. So it's actually, it would be O'Haran, and it was not of the same one would say tribe. It was King Brian, but it was Irish from a northern county up from that area, who apparently settled in. There were several families that may have settled in as tenants or whatever, and so they were doing agriculture and things like that, and for one reason or other, I obtained the name of the other family, even though the DNA would point to descent from King Brian. Now, the other family, of course, speculatively, it could have been one of these situations where they were extremely difficult times and large families, so some of the children, one or more of the children, could have been basically raised by, let's say, one of the tenants who was a spinster, and historically, these children would take the name of that particular family. So that's how I acquired my last name, in all probability. But in any event, as I say, we don't want to necessarily base it on genetics, because not all Jews are genetically descended from the Jews of the Old Testament. They could be descended from many different groups. We know that when the Jews were in exile in Egypt, they had many servants or people they were associated with that could have also gone with them, as when Moses led them out of Egypt and across the Sinai into the Promised Land. So, although Moses, of course, died before he arrived at that point, but so following Joshua, they would have arrived there, and then there were many people in Palestine. So we know that the ethnic makeup of these people could have many different origins. And then, of course, the Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern Europe, probably to a large extent from the Khazars. And we know that they do, of course, have affinities with the Sephardic Jews of Palestine and Europe. So my own ethnic makeup has a very small, minute descent from these Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe. That was where some of my mother's ancestors were from. They were from the region of the Sudetenland. They were probably mostly German people from Saxony, but in those days, these Germans were actually from the Slavic people in that area, who were basically colonized by the Germans of the Holy Roman Emperor. So that's how perhaps I did get some of this ancestry from the Ashkenazi Jews. So I have no prejudice against the Jews. I'm not anti-Semitic or anything. I'm just saying that it's in their interests to be open to this type of conversion to Christ, because from our point of view, that these Jews today are living in somewhat of a bubble, you see. In other words, they are closed off because they have been taught, from their early childhood, and then the instructions they get from certain rabbis, etc., close them off from any contact with reality in terms of the salvation that Christ offers to all of human beings. So I hope that we get past this point in our country, when we get working toward this goal of peace in our world. And I wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. Goodbye.